Hi everybody, my name is Nick. I wrote a gem that will help me set up Docker. I call it Crane Rails because Crane was taken. I named it after these bad boys in Port of Oakland. There we go. And it's pretty simple. It just copies a bunch of files. It has this one command, and what these files do is it allows me to run Docker in my development environment. It's pretty awesome. So this means that if you start a new project and you skip bundle and definitely skip test unit, and then you cd into that project and then run Crane Rails Bootstrap, it will create all the files that you need to set up Docker. So let's see what that does. Okay, so this is pretty much everything that Bootstrap file does. It copies a Vagrant file. I chose to remove the gem file outside of Rails and put it into a Docker image. I'll explain why in a little bit. It copies a database file. The reason I used copy instead of template was because there's ERB that we'll show in a little bit. It sets up this override plugin is just something I'm using for CoreOS, which I'll talk about. So this is basically the roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. So first, let's start with the Vagrant file. That is in So I'm using, instead of Ubuntu, I'm using this thing called CoreOS. It's pretty cool. It's basically the smallest Linux distribution possible with Vagrant pre-installed. I have a sync folder, a forwarded port, and then I set up some Docker images, running one and pulling the other two so that I could run the two when I set up my development environment. Pretty cool. Next, I will show the Tmuxinator configuration. So Tmuxinator is basically allows you to have a YAML file that sets up Tmux session. It's pretty cool. So before Tmux starts, I'm going to have a Vagrant up, boot my Vagrant instance up. Then I'm going to, in these three windows, I'm going to have my Vim environment. I'm going to run my server with Docker. I'm going to run guard with Docker. And then this last thing is called rsync auto. I basically use rsync to copy files between my host and guest system. And rsync auto just to make sure that the firing events are necessary for guard to work. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then let's go talk about these Docker files. So sorry I don't have any slides, it's kind of a rush. So what I try to do with these Docker files is I try to piecemeal them bit by bit. So I have a base Ruby, and all that does is it installs Ruby from source. And then on top of that, I have Rails, which installs the Rails gem, as well as it includes my gem file that I use for my projects. I do this, so I basically have a gem set ready to go. So when I run these containers on top of it, server, guard, or CI, they already have the gem set available, and I don't have to run bundle install every single time. Here I would also add a Rails console. Time to get to that. So let's take a look at what those Docker files look like. So when I develop Docker files, I have a Vagrant file that allows me to run Docker on a little virtual machine. But let's see what the Rails are. So Ruby Docker file, I think I showed this last time. Rails Docker file, it basically copies the gem file and runs bundler and bundler install, pretty simple stuff. And then the Rails server Docker file, all it does is it exposes a port from the image to send to the outside world, and we're just doing the commands that we need to do to boot our server up. I like to be as verbose as possible because I only need to do this once, and that's one of the beautiful things about Docker is that all of my bash stuff can be in source control, and I think that's really cool. Okay. So that pretty much covers that. And I showed how you can just put Crane Rails inside your Rails app. You don't need to include it in your gem file because it's going to just delete it anyway. And then that gives me a session like this. So I have my Vim, I have my server, my guard, and this random rsync auto thing that I pay zero attention to. So I don't have rspec guard, but I do have a more important guard, which is Rubocop. So you see here there are 66 offenses. I'm going to add another offense, and you can see how this works. So if I go to maybe the app, models, well, I guess I don't have the models, controllers, pages controller, and I'm going to add 1,000 hash marks. Okay. So that's definitely, Rubocop's going to complain about that because it's longer than 80 lines. The pink line is my 80 line kind of delimiter. And see here, it'll trigger something in rsync, and then it takes a little while because it's pulled, but now you see that I have an additional offense, and I guess I didn't see it as an offense because it just treats it as a comment, but it ran guard again, which is cool. Similarly, if I go to my pages index, this is typical Rails, but now I'm going to do it within Docker, which is cool. So let's say I want to change the pages index, and let's change it to yes. And there it is. So pretty simple stuff, but I think it's cool that everything's within Docker. So going back to my little slides. So this is how I set up Rails. Anything on top of that will just be linked in. So I didn't show this, but these are also connected to a Postgres image, and anything else I want to add, Redis, Elasticsearch, like the slide I showed last slide, it's pretty easy to do. When I build Redis, which I did on the side, I have a base Redis image, and this goes back to layering your images on top of each other. Your base Redis image allows you to have a Redis CLI talk to a Redis server. So these two can both use this Redis base image, so your containers start up faster. And then similarly, if you want to use a base image like Java, you could build a whole bunch of images on top. So what I kind of struggled with, and I guess this is part of the community, is that people don't really know how to orchestrate these containers coming into place and talking to each other in the first place. So I've taken a look at some options. If you're interested, please talk to me. I'd love to hear your feedback. The first one is called Dees. It basically allows you to use Chef to control the orchestration of containers, like how they talk to each other, how they find each other, etc. There's this one called Flynn, which is kind of like Doku, but I guess a little more advanced. I'm not exactly sure why. And then there's Doku, which is pretty simple. All you do is a git push and does git-based deployment. Ansible, which I guess Russ is getting into. They have this cool blog, use the same analogy that I wanted to use, and I guess they're building some support to where you can use your YAML files to spin up containers. And then there's Vagrant. Vagrant is not just booting up the SOS on my machine. They also have this thing called Packer, so I could take my Vagrant and just make a Vagrant instance and just deploy it. And then this thing called Cert, to where once I deploy these Packer objects, it kind of acts as their service discovery load balancer type thing. But the project I'm most interested in following, and if you're interested in Docker, I'd love to hear your feedback about this, is this CoreOS, the same operating system that I'm using to run both Docker and Rails on my computer. It's really small, and I think that it's cool that they use this thing called the ambassador pattern. Their last blog post did a really good job of explaining it. Basically, it will set up really nicely how these services communicate with each other. And also, when it comes to deploying or updating CoreOS, they have this kind of continuous deployment type thing, where if they need to update CoreOS, your updates can happen pretty much like that. So regardless, I want to be able to pull these images. The best way to do that is through a private Docker repository. There's two options. There's Quay, but I assume this is going to go out of business soon because Docker themselves has now offered private images. What this means is that if you have like secret environment variables like an API token, you can throw it up on either a Docker file or a hosted image, and then use those to build a secure development or staging or production environment. Or of course you could host it all yourself. Docker open sources everything, and you could host the registry by yourself. And that's it. Yeah.
So I get why Docker is useful for deploying things. That made sense. I don't get why it's so useful on your local dev.
Well, I guess I believe the philosophy that your development environment should mimic production as much as possible. For me, it's been definitely very educational because I look at Postgres logs, Redis logs, Nginx logs, and I get to see how they all work and how they all fit with each other. Sorry, follow-up question?
No. Well, I can buy that, but you're not running the things locally that you're running in production.
I would use the same images in production. The only thing that changes is the whole service discovery.
You're going to be running guard in production?
No, I won't be running guard, but I'll be running definitely a Rails server of some sort.
Yeah, it's a Rails server, yeah.
And the reason why I chose to put guard within this whole Docker thing is because ideally, like, I don't want a Ruby installation on my Mac. I think that's pretty cool that from my base Ruby and base Rails image that I can just do everything in Docker land. I don't really have a good answer to why.
I just wanted to know what your answer was.
Because I could, yeah. And I think it's cool that like I can put all of this on like a DigitalOcean instance, and like people can just SSH and have a complete working environment, even if they're on like some old computer. So
Hello.
Cool. Yeah.
So basically your setup is, you have Vagrant, right? And then you have CoreOS as your virtual machine. And then there you have Docker, right?
Yeah.
And then from there you're setting up deployments to where you're not using like a shared folders, you're using rsync to keep in your host file system.
Well, Vim is running on my host right now.
Right.
Let me go back to that big file. So the sync folder is sharing between the folder I'm in and then this folder that Docker is using to build these containers for Rails on top of.
Is that like a Vagrant do that's opening right there?
Yeah,
I can't read it.
It's just a Ruby block.
Okay.
And then these are basically just options that you just look at their website and provide to them.
I see. So does Vagrant use rsync then to keep your folders in sync, or?
Yeah.
Oh, it does. Okay.
And that's why I needed to run this rsync auto, because I couldn't find a way to demonize it. And basically it just washes changes from my host and updates the guest with the files that changed.
Is it polling?
Yeah.
Is it pretty quick, or is it kind of?
Well, I have guard set on a 1 second delay, so that's a little slow, but I don't think fast enough to where that's an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this going to be your dev environment going forward?
I would like it to be. I don't know. I really like it. I definitely learned a ton more about protocols and like the level beneath where Rails was. Yeah.
I think Vagrant has an NFS option instead of rsync. I know that makes all of that.
That's all that means.
Yeah.
But he needs to rsync his files through that to the Docker. Right?
No.
Vagrant's default.
So how Docker works is
Right, but
so Docker sees these volumes right here.
but then you can say it's rsync instead.
And that's how I'm doing the file sharing, and the read write saying that if this gets written, then update my Docker container. The rsync is just between Vim and CoreOS. And this is between CoreOS and a Docker container. Does that make sense?
What operating system are your Docker images based off of?
They're all based off Debian Jessie because it's like one of the lightest Debian installations. Yeah. And it's about time, but I'll show you real quick. So yeah, they're from, this is just something that's supported by Docker itself, so I fixed them.
And once Docker is able to run on OS X directly, then
I won't need Vagrant, yeah.
Yeah, Vagrant goes away, rsync goes away.
Yeah.
That's the dream.
Yep. Cool, thanks.
Thank you.